But again, markets are cyclical, just like the economy. And with what President Trump is trying to do with tariffs, with all the major reforms, with Doge, he has got to be a disruptor. And it is by the very definition of disruption that you're here to shake things up. The status quo does not like that. So we're trying to reset global trade norms. I can't think of anyone who is not for free trade, but we're all for fair trade. And that is ultimately what he's trying to do. Think of the decades that China has been a manipulator of not just their currency, but of entire trade agreements, manipulating different operations around the world. You mentioned fentanyl earlier. They have 160 factories that manufacture the precursors, and everyone who's involved in any sort of foreign policy knows that no operation in China operates without the express blessing of the Chinese Communist Party. They know full well what is happening with those precursors when they are sent to Mexico, then subsequently processed into fentanyl and then smuggled across the border. So China has been complicit in some of the worst IP theft, of course, the fentanyl crisis, which has killed 100,000 Americans every single year, and more. So this is a time for us to set the stage, and I do think that Trump has the upper hand here.
So what do you hope to get out of these trade talks this weekend? Is this just a preamble? Is it a little optimistic to think there may be a grand bargain between the U.S. and China? Is it a hopeful sign? Where are we?
You know, I'm always very hesitant when people talk about grand bargains or big packages or comprehensive. That's not a great word on Capitol Hill, because comprehensive really ends up being something that's filled with poison pills. Now, there's ultimately always going to be compromise, but what we're seeing with these tariffs is really the opportunity for domestic producers to reshore, onshore, and give them the space and opportunity to really scale up production, because we've seen for decades, of course, people moving overseas with cheap labor, a very weird regulatory regime. And that's resulted in, like I said, a loss of IP for our companies. There's a litany of issues here. So I think progress will be made, yes. But will it be the end all be all? I don't think so, because you can't really rectify multiple decades, honestly, 40 years of poor policy in a single weekend. So there's progress to be made.
So when you talk about 40 years of poor policies, I think back to the 50 years that Joe Biden was involved in those poor, it would overlap the 40 years you're talking about that he was a senator, vice president, president. What do you think about him emerging from whatever hole he was in Delaware and lecturing President Trump about inflation, alleged appeasement over Ukraine, saying he's not tough enough on China?
Joe Biden claiming that anyone not being tough enough on China is laughable, especially he himself and, of course, his family, which was bought and paid for by the CCP. We know that business connection exists, that there was absolute corruption there. So, I mean, he is the last person to lecture anyone about being tough on China. Certainly, he did not hold China accountable during COVID. He did not hold any of the global institutions like the WHO accountable for basically being a patsy and an extension of the CCP. Because of Joe Biden's weakness, you have seen an emboldened China, an emboldened Iran. Our adversaries around the world loved Joe Biden because he was very malleable. He was predictable. He was weak. And he, again, I've said this before, you know, he turned into the trafficker in chief, allowing 10.5 million illegals to come into our country, not to mention the millions of drugs that poured across our borders and into the hands of Americans, killing many of them. So absolutely, Joe Biden is reading whatever cue card he was handed. But clearly, I mean, we saw him towards the end of his tenure. It makes me feel bad. The man has severe issues and cognitive issues that need to be acknowledged.
That Democrats continue to try to bury, I guess, although some of them have belatedly tried to tell the quote-unquote truth. The last thing, President headed next week on a big trip to Saudi Arabia, among other places. First big trip beyond going to the Pope's funeral overseas in his second term here. He's teasing out maybe a big announcement of some kind. Some people may think there's an extension of the Abraham Accords 2.0, more peace deals and whatnot. But it also comes amid him speaking out against anti-Semitism, holding Harvard and Columbia and others accountable. And yet we're seeing this week that the library was taken over at Columbia University again. These anti-Israel protests are disrupting people who are just trying to study for finals and whatnot. What's your sense about the left in this country and their refusal? We're showing video of this, that, you know, they continue to get violent and nasty. And the president has been standing up to them and speaking out about it. But the left in this country still is not listening.
Absolutely. You know, it's horrifically disgusting that this is tolerated in any form. I mean, the fact that people claim that, oh, this needs to be protected by the First Amendment, your First Amendment rights, your 5 tenets are protected up until they infringe on someone else's rights. When you start, your peaceful assembly turns violent, it is no longer protected by the First Amendment. Just like if you are trying to shut someone else's free speech down, i.e. our Jewish students on campus, and they're being intimidated, harassed, violently assaulted in some cases, that is not a constitutionally protected exercise. And if you talk to any of these people, most of them aren't students. I represent the largest Jewish student body in the country at University of Florida. I've seen these Palestinian protesters. You talk to them for a bit, most of them have no idea what they're actually protesting. Yeah. They couldn't tell you the first thing about Israel except for the talking points that they've been handed to by these large organizations that are typically backed by Soros and others. And they're just there to really collect a paycheck in many cases. So this is something that needs to be cracked down on. I'm glad that we have a DOJ and an FBI that's going to investigate the instigators of these protests. But again, these college campuses need to have a zero tolerance policy. It's clear that they have not taken this seriously, but Harvard should have been the canary in the coal mine. The president and this Congress is very serious about withholding federal funding for institutions that do not uphold the law and continue to allow these violent protests to take place. Yeah,
you're following up, the president's following up, and so are others in cutting off those federal funds, and some apparently still not getting the lesson. So we're going to continue to see this play out. Kat Cammack, the great Congresswoman from the state of Florida, we appreciate you.
Appreciate you. Have a good one. Go Gators.